You are listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
All right, so welcome to Getting Started in Podcasting, presented by the Archaeology Podcast Network and myself, Chris Webster. This class is for people who want to start a podcast or think they want to start a podcast, and you're kind of on the fence with it, and this will help you get on one side of the fence or the other. So you're either going to do it or you're not. It's not going to teach you how to podcast. We're not going to go over interviewing skills, editing, anything like that. This is a class for you to determine, after I tell you what's involved in starting a podcast, whether or not you want to start a podcast. After that, then you can take additional courses that we're creating to actually get you going with podcasting. But for now, let's just do the intro class. And then at the end, hopefully you'll have decided, yes, I'm going to podcast, or no, I'm going to wait a little while and I'll podcast at another date. All right, so who am I? My name is Chris Webster. I'm an archaeologist, I'm an author, and I'm a podcaster. I started as an archaeologist in 2005 or so when I transitioned from commercial aviation to math and photography to archaeology, as one does. I started a blog probably 7 or 8 years ago, and then at some point with some of my series from there, I created a book out of that. It's called The Field Archaeologist Survival Guide. And then the blog sort of turned into a podcast, which we'll talk about in a minute, and the podcast turned into a bunch of other things. So let's get into that. November 19th, 2011. I'm actually recording this in early November 2017. So I'm coming up on my 7-year anniversary in podcasting, or is that 6 years? Either way, episode 1, news for the week ending 11/12/11. This was a terrible podcast, but I did it. I kept it going weekly and was basically reading Google News stories about my industry, which is cultural resource management. And that's the crappy little icon that I invented for it. I just made that on my iPad and went to town with it. So I said, you know what? I'm going to start a podcast. I picked up a microphone from Radio Shack that sounded really bad. I had GarageBand already on my computer, and all I needed was to learn how to mix a few things together, and I just did it. So that's what you got to do. 3 years ago, December 1st, I started the Archaeology Podcast Network. This isn't even all of our shows here. I started it with the CRM Archaeology Podcast, which now has a new logo, and the An Archaeologist Podcast, which is the top one there, second in from the left. And that's run by Tristan Boyle. He's the co-founder of the APN. Again, like I said, 3 years ago, we started that. We had 2 shows that started with us, Archaeotech and Archifantasies, and they were hosted by other people. And from there, we just went to town. We've got 19 shows now. Some of them are a little inactive, but about 12 or 13 of them are very active. And we've got other shows in production. As of the end of November 2017, we should be over 100,000 monthly subscribers, which is phenomenal considering we started with about 7,000 or so. And that was based on the audience that we brought into the network from our existing shows. So it can be done. And that's where it is. You can see our growth over the past 12 months. As that curve falls off on the end, you can see that's this month. So it's actually rising as we go along. But at the end of October, we had 96,400. So since we've been gaining about 5,000 or 6,000, I don't know what happened in October. We got a little bump last October as well. We got a little bump in March. You never know what's going on with the numbers. Maybe it was an interview. Maybe somebody posted something that you did. Who knows what it was? We had a few pretty high profile interviews in October, actually in September. And I think those were promoted out by people in October, which helped boost our numbers. So that looks really good. And these are subscribers. These are people who come to the website every month and download our stuff, or they do it through iTunes or Stitcher or something like that. So, all right. So let's get into this a little bit and talk about podcasts. So what are podcasts? Well, if you wouldn't be here if you didn't know what podcasts were, quite frankly. But it's generally audio or video for that matter. But people generally consider it to be just audio. They were started, the time frame for when they started varies depending on who you're talking to. But in the early 2000s, after Apple allowed the functionality for podcasts within iTunes, they kind of blew up at that point because then there was easy access to it. Before, it was relatively difficult to get access to a podcast. It was even more difficult. It was easy to record them always. I mean, you just needed to sit down and record. Recording a good podcast, that's always been a challenge for people, but just recording yourself and then cutting it together and then putting it on the internet, that's kind of always been easy. But that's generally what a podcast is. So it's an audio format, and that's what we're going to go over today. All right, so when you're creating your podcast, there are 4 big things you need to think about before you start that podcast. One is your frequency, and I don't mean FM 99.7 on the FM dial. I don't mean that. I mean, how often does your podcast come out? Because if you're taking this course, there's a pretty good chance that you have an eye towards monetizing your podcast, okay? You're looking to make money with it. If you're looking to make money with it, then you're going to need some sort of regularity. Even if that frequency is a series, like let's say you come out with 10 episodes and you drop them all Netflix style, and then in 3 months you come out with 10 more episodes or whatever the time frame is, that's fine. As long as you're predictable and you are reliable and trustworthy, because you're trying to build a customer base or even a client base, depending on how you're looking at this. And you want them to be able to rely on you to give a certain product that you said you're going to give. If every time you went to the grocery store and you didn't know if they were going to be open or closed because they didn't have hours, or it's a Tuesday at 6 p.m. and they're closed because they just decided to close that day, you probably start going to a different grocery store because they're not reliable. You can't keep going there, okay? So that's frequency. So come up with, depending on your content and probably your length of show, which we'll talk about in a minute, how often do you want this to come out? On the Archaeology Podcast Network, we have a daily show, and that's a super short show. It's anywhere from 3 minutes to no more than 15 minutes. We have shows that are between 30 and 45 minutes, and some of those come out every 2 weeks. Some of them come out monthly. Most of our every 2 week shows are, so I guess bi-monthly. Is that bi-monthly? Anyway, most of our every 2 week shows are about an hour, and we don't stick strictly to that, but they're about an hour. So, and that's every 2 weeks. So style is another thing. The first podcast I started, that one in 2011, was just me. It was a single person. I was reading news stories. Occasionally when I got through, I did that for about a year. As I got through it, I did actually a little bit of, commentary on those shows. And the commentary was actually just me maybe commenting on the news stories that I was reading and things like that. And that's fine. That's a decent style. A couple other styles. And again, the best way to learn this is to just listen to podcasts that you actually like and copy what they do. I mean, don't reinvent the wheel, okay? If there's a podcast that's doing a style that you like, then do their style. I mean, don't copy them directly with some of their content, but obviously you can copy their style and things like that. And I'll get into that in a second. So style, other styles you can do are you and an interview. If it's always an interview show, and that interview can be local, it can be remote. It's two co-hosts maybe, and maybe you're sitting across from each other and you guys are bantering and talking about stuff like a morning talk show kind of thing. Or any number of co-hosts, quite frankly, and they can all be in the same room. Or you can be, and I've noticed if you're in the same room, it's a little easier to create organic conversation that way. But if you're not in the same room, then organic conversation is a little more difficult to engineer. And yes, you have to engineer organic conversation, which we'll talk about later. So anyway, one of the other styles is a panel style show. That's what I turned my first podcast into. I turned it into me, plus about 4 or 5 other people. It's rotating around a little bit. And we've been doing that show every 2 weeks for the last 5 years now, because we started that in 2012. So yeah, 5 years. And so I guess that's my 6-year anniversary coming up. Wow, math. Anyway, so a panel style show where I'm basically the primary host and I lead the conversation, but we talk about all sorts of different things. So, we have discussions, we have commentary, things like that. And that's another style that you can do. We also bring interviews into that show. We bring interviews into that style show. Okay, length we already talked about. So you just have to decide. There's no strict policy on length. You might hear some people say a podcast should be 20 to 30 minutes because that's an average commute. You'll hear people say a podcast should be 30 to 45 minutes because that's an average workout, some time on the treadmill or something like that. There really is no style. That's the beauty of podcasts. If your podcast is 7 hours long, let's take Dan Carlin's Hardcore History. Their podcast is 6 to 8 hours long, but they only do it once every 6 months because there's a lot of research that goes involved. I guarantee you, most people aren't sitting down and listening to that in one go. They're going to listen to a chunk here, a chunk there, and a chunk there. And that's okay. There are podcasts I've tried to listen to that were longer. And sometimes I find that long podcasts are really just people who can't get to the point. If it's full of content, that's great. I'll continue listening. I'll listen to some now and I'll listen to some later. Helps if you break that up into segments maybe so people can create little chunks of it. But you don't have to, okay? So the length really just depends on you and your content. If you have a podcast that is very technical, that is very involved, very in-depth, and maybe people are even sitting there taking notes or following along in something else, you might want to make that shorter just so they can turn their brain off for a little while after the show and have a time to process what they just learned, okay? If your podcast is more fun, a little more entertaining, maybe, then it can be longer because the time will fly by for your listeners and they won't even notice it. So that's one thing to consider. So now the theme of your podcast goes along with all three of those, okay? The theme of your podcast should be consistent. If this is why I started the Archaeology Podcast Network. On the Cultural Resource Management or CRM Archaeology podcast, I was constantly bringing in interviews that had very little to do with CRM Archaeology. I just really wanted to talk to the person. It had to do with archaeology in a way, but Cultural Resource Management Archaeology is a very specific thing. And the focus of our show was to help people in the field and have helpful tutorials and things like that, and some commentary on business practices and other things. And when I brought in a dream specialist to talk about, dreams and things like that, that was a great show, but it really didn't belong on that podcast. So I started the APN so I could start other shows. Now, you don't need to start a network, but if you're constantly finding yourself doing other styles of shows, other types of shows, then your audience might say, well, what the hell is this podcast about? What am I doing here? Why am I even taking this course? Why am I even listening to this podcast? Because it's all over the board. Now, maybe that's your style. Maybe it's eclectic. Maybe people expect that. But, say that from the outset. If you are going to focus on one thing, then try to keep that. If you want to focus on other things and you think you have the content for it, start a second show, start a third show, but do something that you can do consistently. All right, so once you have decided on all those things, before you even record anything, and I wouldn't say that, go ahead and record whatever you want, record all the things. But before you really start your show, you really should come up with your first 10 episode ideas, okay? Now, episode 0 is going to be your introduction, typically, okay? And this really should say 11. I really should do that because your episode 0 shouldn't count, and then you'll have 10 episodes after that. The idea here is your episode 0 is your introduction. That's the one you use to submit to iTunes and Stitcher and all the other places, because it takes a few days for them to review your podcast and get it online. Once that's online, you don't promote it. You don't tell anybody it's there, but you tell people, hey, I submitted this on the 5th. And you tell people, hey, on the 20th, my podcast is going to debut, or on the 1st of the month, my podcast is going to debut. Give it a lot of time. That way it's in the system, it's ready to go. And then when they go there to finally hear your show on the day it opens, they will see the first episode, which is episode 0, and then they'll see your first interview or your first episode, which is real content. I always hate it when I listen to a new podcast and they release one episode, and the first episode is, here's what our show is going to be about, and then nothing. And then I got to wait another month, or I got to wait 2 weeks, or whatever their frequency is for another episode. So if you come up with your first 10 episode ideas, this does 2 things. 1, it helps you flesh out your idea. If you can't come up with 10 episode topics or ideas, you don't have to stick with them, but you have to come up with the ideas. Okay, this is really solid. Do this. Come up with the topics for those first 10 episodes. If you can't do that, you haven't fleshed out your idea good enough. Okay, you haven't got your podcast concept fully fleshed out. Because consider this: if you didn't do this, and then you did say 4 or 5 episodes, and then comes time to do another episode and you're out of ideas. Now you just wasted your time and there's only 5 episodes, and you do what's called pod fading, which is you just fade into the background, and now you've got one of those millions of podcasts on iTunes that has 6 episodes and they haven't posted in 3 years. Okay? You don't want that. You want to have a plan. Have a start plan, have a mid plan, have an exit plan, okay? And then plan for that. Just like a TV series. They know when they're going to stop most of the time. #Firefly. Anyway, so for your introduction, like I said, start with that. And then if you have those 10 ideas, once you finally do start recording, what I typically tell people to do is record 3 episodes. The first one can be your episode 0 if you want, but then record 2 more episodes that are just pure content, okay? That way, when somebody goes to subscribe to your podcast for the first time or listen for the first time, you not only provide them an introduction to who you are and who your co-hosts are if you have them, but what your show is going to be about. And then there's 2 solid shows that have solid content, and they're like, okay, this is great. I'm going to keep subscribing and move on. There's no ambiguity. They're either going to like it or they're not. If they're not going to like it after the 2nd episode, they're probably not going to like it after the 10th episode. So they'll either subscribe or they won't subscribe, and they're not going to waste your time. You're not going to waste their time. Okay? So that's why we do the first 10 episode ideas. Now, once you're actually recording, you've got all that done, it's time to learn how to be a good host. Okay? And part of that is being a good manager. Now, if you have a co-host and you're both started the show together, maybe there's 3 of you and there's 3 co-hosts and you all started the show together, you have to elect one person to at least be the host for that day, even if you transition it, throughout. Maybe it's the person that's best at it. maybe you just decide, you know what, today I'm going to be the host. And the reason for that is the host has to keep an eye on the clock if you're timed, if you don't want to go over a certain time, or if you have segments and they need to keep an eye on that, because you can quickly get into a conversation and lose focus on the segments. And then, you have a 20-minute segment that ends up going 30 minutes. Then you either have to cut it, you have to redo it, or something like that. So you don't want that to happen. The host also manages the flow of the podcast. So what I mean by that is if there's a lull in the conversation, if you're interviewing somebody, if they stop talking abruptly, which happens because they just finished their thought and you maybe thought they were going to keep going and they didn't, and you don't have another question ready, you have to manage that flow. You have to be able to jump in right there and say, oh, this, and keep that conversation going. Or part of what you also have to do is engage your other co-hosts. On my primary show, the CRM Archaeology podcast, we have 4 co-hosts, and sometimes, one host will get into a nice long monologue and they'll do 4 or 5 minutes. And then before we know it, that's a quarter of one of the segments. And I have to make sure that I don't do too much talking either. I'll have to get my opinions out as well, because I'm part of the show. But if somebody hasn't spoken for the whole segment, or we get into the second segment and the 1 or 2 people didn't speak the whole time, I'll bring them in on the next segment. And I'll say, hey, what do you think about this? It's your turn. What do you think about this? And that's just part of being a good host, is engaging everybody, and your co-hosts and your guests, and making sure everybody's doing everything. And part of that, I already talked about timing, and that's just making sure that you're on your schedule. If you have one, you don't need to have one. But if you do, somebody needs to watch that clock. Somebody needs to have another iPad or phone or just an alarm clock or something sitting there so they can watch that clock, okay? And show notes. Show notes are the best way to keep your show on track. Now, I use show notes probably incorrectly, but I use it in 2 different ways. Show notes, for what most people who are content consumers relate to, is show notes are the notes associated with the podcast that say, here's the links, here's something about the show, here's some contact information. That's show notes. But I start those show notes with my notes about the show that we used to start it with. So if we have an interview, I'll do research, and I'll have my segment 1, 2, and 3. I'll have my intro, I'll have my outro. I'll have all those things written down in a Google Doc. That's what we use. And I'll have my research questions that I've come up with for the interviewee. Okay. And that's part of being a good host as well, is really getting those things going. And again, we're not talking about actually creating a podcast in this first lesson, but I need you to know what's involved with all this, okay? There's going to be research involved. There's going to be some work involved. You can't just sit down in a mic and start recording. You can, but it might not sound very good unless you're just a natural at it, okay? So keeping good show notes, starting good show notes, writing down links as you come across them. You can do that in the editing process too. And so if you don't want to take yourself out of the show and type something while you're doing that. But sometimes you come up with other questions. And the best thing to do if you come up with a question while someone is talking is to quickly type it down. Otherwise, you're going to be sitting there thinking about that question and not actually listening to the person. And part of being a good host is being a good listener, because I've had it happen before. I'm speaking from experience here, where I didn't write down a question and I'm thinking, oh, I just need to ask this question. I didn't want to forget. So I'm going through it in my head and I wasn't really listening. And they answered the question right before I asked it. And they're like, well, I'll state it again, blah, blah, blah. And I go back and listen and editing. I was like, oh my God, I'm an idiot. I'm a total idiot. So be a good host, manage your co-hosts and your interview, manage the flow so it sounds natural and it's moving right along. Manage your timing if you have it. Keep a stopwatch going. Mr. Stopwatch is what I use for Mac. It's actually really good. Stays on top of the window, nice and big, but doesn't get in the way. And then keep show notes as you go. Create the show notes beforehand. Keep your notes as you go. Keep them updated. And then you can use those notes to create the notes for the show that actually get published. Okay, so interviewing. We talked about interviewing a little bit in the last one as part of being a good host, but let's really get into this. If you're going to interview somebody, you need to do research on them. Now, I'll get into cold interviews in a second, but research is what you're going to have to do for most of them, okay? And part of the reason for that is going back to being a good host. All of a sudden, you've got this great conversation going. It's going where you didn't expect it to, blah, blah, it's just going right through. You guys are having an awesome conversation. And then 3 or 4 minutes before your planned break, it stops. They're done answering that question. The sort of thread of the conversation has come to an end. You need another question to go to, okay? If you've got those listed out from your research, you can be like, okay, well, now let's talk about this. For me and an archaeologist, I'll be like, hey, so you worked on this site. Let's talk about that now, or something like that. Or this was your theory. Let's talk about that. So if you do your research, you'll have other places to go. Now, I often have way more questions and way more things to talk about than the interview probably allows. Like if it's an hour-long interview, I'll have way more stuff written down than I'll ever get to. And this is why if your show is timed, let's say you keep your podcast to an hour, if I was actually ask all those questions and we were just to go through everything and do it straight out, then the show would be 2 hours long. It would be 3 hours long. It would be too long, and nobody's going to listen to that. I've had actually complaints about 2 hour long shows back in the day when I first started my show, and we weren't keeping time. So when that happens, people just stop listening. They stop subscribing. They send angry emails, things like that. So if you're keeping to a time, have all those questions. Again, you might not answer them. You might not ask them all, but you can go back later, maybe do a second follow-up interview or something like that. Or if you want to just keep it going, you can do a 2-part interview. So just cut it in the middle somewhere. You'll have to add an outro and say, hey, for part 2, check back in 2 weeks, something like that. So cold interviews, I think this could be more appropriate for certain circumstances. And I've done it before and what I mean by cold interview, actually, let me back up a little bit, is a cold interview is where you don't do any research, obviously. You just come in. I knew kind of about the person, otherwise we wouldn't be interviewing them, but we just come in and ask them questions. The reason for that occasionally is, for me, is if I don't want to come in with a biased opinion. Maybe they have a controversial opinion about something, and that's the only bit I know. I don't want to come in with a biased view of their past and what led them to that. I want them to state in their own terms what brought them to their ideas and then go from there. I don't want to be influenced by the research that I did about them, okay? I don't do that very often, and sometimes I did that in the past because I didn't do any research. So I got pretty good at doing cold interviews and asking questions. But a planned cold interview can be a good thing. Okay, so interview questions. We've mentioned interview questions already, of course. Have a lot of those planned out. Make sure they're logical. Don't say, hey, what about your mom? And in the next one, what about your research? And the next one, do you have a dog? Don't plan them like that. Be smart, be logical, listen to NPR, listen to other news stations, listen to how they do interviews. Start listening to style rather than content when you're consuming media now, and that'll help you become a better podcaster and a better interviewer. Okay, organic conversation. I've mentioned organic conversation before. It's actually really difficult to create that. If you're all in the same room and you're all sitting in front of microphones, that can be a lot easier because body language is really important. You don't realize how important body language is until you don't have it. When we're doing multi-host shows, we're usually doing it over Skype and actually Zencastr now, which doesn't even have video, but we're usually doing it over Skype where the Skype call, we shut off the video because most people are on a Wi-Fi connection or something like that, and video just kills the bandwidth, okay? So we don't have video, so we just have audio cues for each other. And I actually manage the conversation in the background. I say, do you have a follow-up comment or question? We use FC or Q. And the people in my co-hosts, they will say, oh, I have a follow-up, or I have a brand new question, or I have a comment on this one, okay? Follow-up means they're taking it in a slightly different direction. Question means they're taking it in a completely different direction. A comment means I need to go to them first. So if I have one of my hosts says, I have a question, the other one says, I have a follow-up, and the other one says, I have a comment, I'm going to do the comment first, then I'll do the follow-up, then I'll do the question. But of course, after the comment, I'll make sure the follow-up is still relevant. Maybe the person who had the comment answered the question in the follow-up, or it's no longer relevant or something like that. So when you do that, and I say go ahead in the background, or I say go ahead on air and I delete that, I say, hey, Tom, go ahead. It's your question next. They'll go and say, okay, so what I was going to say is this. I'll delete all that and then just go right to their question. And that develops the appearance of organic conversation. Now, you might have some really good, really natural co-hosts, and you don't really need to do that. If it's a more free-flowing, maybe like a comedy show or something like that, or just a more free-flowing show, that might happen naturally and actually be organic. But you just have to be conscious of the fact that it might not be. And if it's not, you have to create that. Otherwise, you're going to sound weird and scripted, and people aren't going to like it. Okay, so here's some more detailed information on show notes. What do you want to do? Just look at podcasts that you've seen. Again, your best examples are podcasts that you like. If you like it, there's a reason you like it. Copy their style, okay? For my show notes, what I'm referring to on this show notes, I mean the notes that are listed and published with the episode. Those are either listed, depending on the podcast player you're using, they're listed on the screen of your smartphone or something like that. Or when you go to the website, it's on the website, because usually that's where that's pulling from, depending on what hosting service you're using. Be consistent, first off. Make sure your show notes are consistent. I like to have a single paragraph. That is the iTunes description that ends up going in, okay? But that's on my website. There's a single paragraph. If there's any other paragraphs or anything like that, I try not to put too much commentary in there, but some of my co-hosts will send me that, or some of my podcast hosts will send me that, and I'll put that stuff in there. But that first paragraph needs to say what the show is about, and that goes in the summary, okay? Then I'll have links, any links that were mentioned in the show. I've had hosts in the past say, oh, we'll put that in the show notes, and then they forget to put that in the show notes. There's no actual link, okay? If you're going to say it's in the show notes, put it in the show notes and organize it logically. I have one show that does amazing research, Archaeological Fantasies, and they'll often have 10, 15, 20 links, and they'll have them all organized, and then I'll have to put those in there, make sure they look good, and make sure they're organized, okay? That way people can find them. And they're usually in chronological order, so if somebody's halfway through the show, they can look halfway through the links and maybe see that link right there. And then tags, depending on the website you're using. I use Squarespace for the Archaeology Podcast Network. We have over 1,500 pages, so we have a search field, but we also have tags. So if I tag, Mesolithic or something like that, somebody can click on that and find all the shows where I tagged it Mesolithic, and see what that looks like, or prehistoric, or historic, or artifact, or employee, or something like that. We use those tags. I never put more than 3 or 4 tags on a show, because the search is actually really good, and the search searches the text of the show notes. And if you have a good description, then it should be able to find that. Formatting goes back to being consistent. Leave your formatting consistent. It's nice to be able to flip through and not have to search for information like, oh, on this post, the links are over here, and on this post, the links are over there. Make everything look nice, efficient, and professional. So that was podcasts. Now you've decided to do your show. You've decided to that you've got a good idea. You wrote down all your ideas. You know what format you're going to do. You know what frequency you're going to do. Now you need to start recording. What do you need to do that? All right, so at the very basic level, you're going to need 4 things. You're going to need a computer, okay? Whether it's yours or something rented or borrowed or whatever, you're going to need a computer. You're going to need software, some sort of software for editing. You're going to need a microphone if you want it to sound good. People do record into their laptop microphone, but that sounds terrible. You're not going to want to do that for very long. And you're going to need a website. Now, the website can be a hosting service. We'll talk about that in a minute. You don't have to know any programming or coding if you don't want to, but you can. All right, so for computer, obviously Mac or PC is the typical choices, tablet and a smartphone. Now, tablet and smartphone aren't necessarily computers, and it really depends on whether or not you use those. Depends on the software you're trying to use and the type of podcast you have, okay? If you are doing a podcast that is, really easy to cut together, you're not doing a lot of editing, you can actually do that on a tablet. If you're using, say, Apple tablets, GarageBand on the tablet will allow you to record and do some light editing. You're not going to be able to do a lot of stuff. You're not going to be able to do a lot of post-processing. But if you're putting in good audio and you don't need to do a lot of work, especially early on, and you just want to get started, you can actually do that. A lot of the same functionality is in smartphones, iPhones, Galaxy phones, for Android, things like that. They all have stuff where you can do some light editing and some light post-processing and things like that. But you're going to need one of these 4 things to just be able to put your podcast together, because it is coming down the line soon. Zencastr is one of the things I use, and we'll talk about that a little more later, but they have kind of a soundboard thing. So you can actually create your podcast live, put in your intro music, put in your ads, and just click on them, and then it all ends up in one track. And you kind of don't need any editing if you don't want to do that. If you're fine with the format and you don't need to cut anything out or add anything in, then you can kind of create your podcast live as you're recording it, and then just take that file and export it. So if that's the case, you wouldn't need any of these. You would just need one of these things in order to make the call happen and record it, and then go on about your business. Okay, so back into software, some of the more common things that people use are GarageBand for Macs, and that's, I think it's either $10 or free. It's super cheap. It's really powerful, actually. That first podcast I did for a year was all recorded and edited in GarageBand. And then for the next, I think, 3 years of the CRM Archaeology podcast, before I started the APN, it was all GarageBand. And then I moved to Audition for various reasons. But GarageBand is a great software. Allows you to do some mixing, allows you to do some post-processing. You can do some EQing of your tracks and things like that, and some stuff. You can really get into the weeds on it, but not incredibly powerful, but powerful enough for most podcasters, I would say. And again, that only works on Mac systems. Audacity is great. It feels a little cheap. It's open source, and it has that sort of feel to it. But one of the great things about Audacity is it's a relatively powerful tool. It's got a lot of plugins you can get for it, for all your post-processing if you want to get into that. It works on Mac and PC, both platforms. So no matter who you are, you can use Audacity. Adobe Audition also works on both platforms, and that is probably the industry standard as one of the most powerful audio editing tools on the planet. Okay, I record straight into it most of the time, from my mixer right into my computer, and I can do all the heavy editing and post-processing on the back end and mastering, all that kind of stuff. And it's $20 a month for the subscription, basically, to that. Well, one of the things I like about it is that it is cross-platform, so I keep all our files in Dropbox, and if one of my hosts use my Audition account, they can record straight into it, and all their files will go into Dropbox, and then I have access to them. They record on a PC, and I edit on a Mac, and there's no change, there's no formatting anything, there's nothing like that. It just works, so that's why I like it. There's other software out there. Heisenberg, look that up. Reaper, that's another one. SoundForge for editing, things like that. You can really get into the weeds on all that stuff, and we will dive into that a little more on the more detailed courses. So a microphone, you're going to need a microphone. There's 3 types of microphones you can get in general. There's obviously way more, but for these purposes, for your purposes, just getting started, there's 3 you should probably think about. There's the real simple setup, which can just be, a $20, $30 microphone that you pick up somewhere at a store, and you've just got that sitting. My first microphone, I think, was like a $40 or $50 iRig mic from Radio Shack, and I bought this kind of weighted metal microphone stand that was probably this tall. And I set that microphone on a bunch of books, so I had it sitting right in front of me like that. No mic stand, no other thing, nothing like that. So anyway, that worked out really well for me for a while. And then I wanted to, when I went to my first conference as a podcaster, I wanted to be able to record in the field. And that iRig would have worked. I could have plugged it into my smartphone, but that whole setup back in 2004 or whatever that was, wasn't working very well. Not 2004, 2013 or so. Wasn't really working as well as it does today. So one of the things that I decided to do was I picked up a Zoom H4, and that ended up being my field mic and my studio mic, okay? Even though I didn't have a studio, I just had my house. But that ended up becoming my field mic and my studio mic because it was a nice recorder. Now, what you can kind of see down here is the new H6. I actually just picked this up yesterday as I'm recording this now. And the H4, though, allows you to do 4 tracks. That's 2 stereo mics on top and then 2 XLR mics on the bottom. The H6 just gives you 4 of those, plus the 2 stereo mics, or you got different attachments and you can put 2 more XLRs. So you can actually record 6 tracks in the field, which would be great for people who have a lot of hosts and they're always on the road. But also, you can plug all the Zoom lines into your computer like I'm doing now and just use it as a microphone, okay? And I used the H4 as a microphone for several years before I actually moved into the Reno Collective here in Reno, Nevada, and started using the podcast studio that we're setting up now. So studio mic, these are generally XLR mics, and XLR is a little 3-prong thing that are basically professional level microphones. And you can you can spend anywhere from $60, $70 for an Audio-Technica ATR 2100, which is a great starter microphone. Check that out on Amazon. And you can go all the way up to, the Youll PR40, which is I think a $300 or $400 microphone, maybe even higher than that. Really, you need to figure out, and more expensive doesn't necessarily mean better. You need to figure out what sounds good for you. Go to a guitar store or something like that. They'll often have microphones, and you can maybe try them out and see how you think you sound best, because your voice is going to sound different with different microphones. If you do that, though, keep in mind you're going to go down into the weeds on studios, because if you get a microphone like that, you're probably going to need a boom arm and a stand for it to get it off the table, because all those sounds on your table will translate right into the microphone. You'll probably need to plug it into a mixer or something like that. You don't really need a mixer if you're just one person, unless you really want to fine-tune your settings before it gets into the computer. Or you can just level everything out and then EQ in the computer, have your presets there. But I'm just saying, if you go the studio route, you're going to end up with, foam in the background. You're going to end up with all kinds of stuff, and it's going to be crazy. You can go that route if you want, but make sure you really want to do this and really get into podcasting before you go nuts with a studio. Or you can find, like we have here at the Reno Collective, and the University of Nevada here in Reno has the Innovation Center, Well, they have a studio there, and we're offering a monthly membership. Find out in your hometown whether or not there's a place you can have a monthly membership and just use their professional studio. That way, it might cost you a little bit more at first just to use a membership for this kind of thing, but at least you didn't have a bunch of gear, and then you can see whether or not you like it. And if you don't like it, you didn't sink your money into a ton of gear that you're going to have to unload now. And if you do like it, then you can consider, well, am I going to go buy my own gear? Am I going to keep coming here? Make your choices there. All right, so website. The reason you need a website is basically two reasons. You need a place to store your show notes, and you need a place to store your file. One thing people don't realize is that iTunes, Stitcher, Google, none of those places actually store your file, okay? They don't store the MP3 file that you create for the podcast. They are just a directory. They're a Sears catalog for podcasts, and they use that RSS feed to direct somebody from that site to your site where they pull your file. So your website needs to have the capability of high amount of downloads, if we're thinking optimistically here, and it needs to be able to handle that level of traffic, okay? Now you can create a website with WordPress, Squarespace, a bunch of different things, as long as that website has the ability to put a file on there and create an RSS feed, okay? That's really the only caveat to the whole thing, okay? Then the website can be as complicated or as simple as you want it beyond that. You can put a player on there so people can listen directly on your website or download the file on your website, all that stuff. But at the very minimum, to distribute it to the major distributors, you need an RSS feed. So it needs to be able to generate that from your file. And then within that RSS feed will be the show title, the episode, a bunch of other tags, the summary, the length of the episode, things like that. Libsyn is one of the services out there. There's a number of them. Libsyn's probably the best that will do two things for you. One, it'll make it so you don't need a website, because Libsyn allows you to put all the show notes and everything right in there, and then they create the RSS feed and send it to a number of different services, iTunes, YouTube, all kinds of different places. They will just do that automatically depending on the level account you have and what you have hooked up to it. They'll even make a smartphone app for you that you can sell in the App Store, 99 cents or something for people to get your whole entire catalog on an app. And that's the high end of Libsyn though. One thing a lot of people do is they put their stuff on SoundCloud. Now, SoundCloud has some benefits in that it's easy. You just put a file up there. You can have a player on a website. SoundCloud, I found, SoundCloud podcasts are difficult to subscribe to, I found, outside of SoundCloud. Sometimes they're not easy to find if they didn't distribute themselves properly. People think, oh, I just need to be on SoundCloud, and that's it. One of the big problems with SoundCloud is they were bailed out by somebody who bought them, give them a ton of money not too long ago, and they may not be around much longer. So they're having a problem trying to figure out how to make money and keep themselves going with increasing bandwidth, because there's no ads on the stuff they put up there. It's not like YouTube, where YouTube can just put a banner ad over your video. You can't put an ad very easily without permission over an audio file. It just doesn't work that way. So SoundCloud's trying to figure themselves out. And also, if you have a podcast that's more frequent than about an hour a month, you're going to have to pay for SoundCloud, so it won't be free. The free version gives you so many hours, I think, of upload per month. And then as you need more, you have to pay for more. And if you're going to pay for anything, you may as well just pay for Libsyn or pay for another website and just get all your stuff in there, and it'll probably be better for you. But the point of this is you need a place to store that file that people can access it, and you need a place to put your show notes where they can be attached to that file and people can access it. Okay, so you created your podcast, you recorded it, you exported it using your software, you did all those things. Now what are you going to do with it? Well, you've got to distribute, market, and monetize. All right? Now, prior to distribution, there are a few things you're going to need to do. You're going to make sure you have a podcast icon, JPEG or PNG. Now, these stats are based on iTunes, because let's face it, iTunes is the industry standard catalog out there, and if it's not on iTunes, then it's not really anywhere. People look for podcasts on iTunes, and then they might subscribe to it somewhere else, but iTunes is general. People look first, okay? Now, the requirements for iTunes: JPEG or PNG, 1400 by 1400 pixels, up to 3000 by 3000 pixels. I've read on there that if it's not 3000 by 3000, you'll never be featured on the front page. You probably won't be anyway, but if there's even a slight possibility, you won't be unless it's a high resolution. 72 DPI, and then something that a lot of industry podcasters are talking about, Apple doesn't actually promote this, but they say less than 500 kilobytes. There's been some people that have shown that if your podcast icon is more than that, then it can actually crash in iTunes, like the feed won't validate and things like that. Then the minute you drop it down under 500 kilobytes, the feed validates, and it all suddenly magically works. Apparently, Apple's not acknowledging that, and they don't say that. But people that are in the know on this and actually test these things have proven that to be true. So just do it. No big deal. It loads faster anyway, and it's a good thing. Your RSS feed, Cast Feed Validator is a good one to use. If you're using something like Squarespace, your feed's probably going to work because they know what they're doing. But if you're using some other service, like a WordPress site and a plugin, you might want to test that feed first before you bring it over to iTunes or Stitcher or Google or wherever you're sending it, and run it through Cast Feed Validator. And Cast Feed Validator will tell you all the things you're getting out of that RSS feed. Because an RSS feed is just basically, again, it's a catalog to access your file, but it has all these tags in it. And these tags are filled with information about your podcast that you put in there, okay? You might want to use another, if you're using something like Squarespace and you want to use all the other tags that are available for a podcast, but Squarespace doesn't offer that, then you can go to other services. Just look for stuff that allow you to add the metadata and tags to different RSS feeds, and you can punch it in there. It's an extra step, but you might want to actually do that. Music. If you put music in your podcast, most of them are entertaining. If they have some sort of intro and outro music, that helps break it up a little bit. You can have ad music in the middle, underneath your ads for other things if you're going to have ads in there, or maybe just a segment transition music, stuff like that. Make sure it's license free unless you pay for it. And if it's license free, sometimes it's license free if you give attribution. I use bensound.com, and we have on our website and in the outros for some of our shows, music provided by bensound.com. They just require attribution. I feel like attribution on the website is just exactly what they're asking for, because people can go back to that and see, oh, they got the music from Bensound. So, or you can pay for it. If you pay for it, typically you don't have to attribute it to anybody. You now own the rights to that music and can use it for whatever you want. Now, some stuff like GarageBand has a ton of music. I mean, I used for the first 5 years, for the first 3 years, really, I used GarageBand music in all my stuff. And that's automatically license free. You don't have to attribute Apple to that. You just say, you don't say anything. You just use it and it's done. And everybody knows. Of course, everybody knows. I've heard music from my early shows on commercials on TV before, and I was like, oh, they edited with GarageBand. Nice. So just keep that in mind. If you use music from, say, a friend's band or something like that, make sure you attribute it to them and make sure you let them know. Make sure they know that you're putting this on a podcast and they don't find out some other way, because artists aren't working for free, okay? They want to make money. You're a friend, so maybe they'll just let you do that, but don't assume that, okay? Ask them nicely and say, hey, well, sometimes just getting the word out there is not enough for them. Maybe they don't care about that or something like that, but make sure it's okay for you to use that music. And if you play music on your show, I'm not even going to get into the legal aspects about that, but it's wrong, okay? You can't play any music unless you're doing certain things and you play certain segments. Look that up on your own. This is not a law tutorial, so I don't want to be taken down for bad legal advice. As I've already mentioned, the 3 places you definitely want to put your podcast are iTunes, Google, and Stitcher Radio. A lot of people listen to podcasts in those 3 places, and a lot of other podcast aggregators will get their information from iTunes or Google or Stitcher Radio. I don't think Stitcher, but Google and iTunes, they'll just take those catalogs and use them as their own. And now you've got another podcast player with another place to find podcasts. So if you want to go find out other places to put it, that's fine, but definitely start with these 3. All right, as far as distribution goes, you want to, if you're doing this to monetize eventually, you'll want to make sure that you're using your social media properly, okay? But you got to figure out first, what is my podcast for? Is my podcast itself generating revenue? Which means, do I want to maybe charge for episodes and put them on something like Patreon, or have a membership site or something like that where everything is behind a paywall? That's possible. Or are you using your podcast to send people to something else, like a company website or an Etsy site or something like that where you're actually selling something? Then you have to factor that in. Either way, you're going to have to pay attention to social media. I post a lot of Archaeology Podcast Network episodes on different social media groups on Facebook, different Facebook groups, different Facebook pages, things like that. Now, be careful, because if the group has policies and you're not a moderator of that group, if it has policies against, say, posting links without having any conversation or anything like that, they may not appreciate it. It might be totally appropriate for that podcast to be listed in that group, which totally fits with their topic and everything like that. But some moderators are like, yeah, you're just posting links over here and trying to get likes. I'm like, yeah, but it's also good information. Just make sure you play by their rules and check that out. Twitter's a great place because If you don't know anything about Twitter, use hashtags. I do hashtag archaeology and hashtag history on every single one of our podcasts. They go out automatically from Squarespace to Twitter and Facebook. And by doing that, the 1,500 or so followers we have on Twitter will see that in their news feeds because they follow Archaeology Podcast Network. They like us. So, but if it's hashtag archaeology, way more people follow hashtag archaeology than actually follow the people who are creating the information. So you put those hashtags in there that are appropriate for your industry, and a lot of people will see it. So keep that in mind. You also want to try to make it shareable and repostable on Twitter. Keep in mind the 140 character limit. And if you have a really long tweet with a whole bunch of hashtags, it's going to be difficult for people to share. So another place, if your podcast is professional, would be LinkedIn. LinkedIn is a great place. It has groups, and it's a good place for people to engage with you in a professional way. Okay, so there's groups, there's the news feed, there's all kinds of stuff, and you can do it really just like Facebook, but it's perceived as a little more professional. And then finally, of course, your company website. You may not distribute anywhere. You just put the stuff in your company website. One reason for that might be you're constantly answering questions that are all the same, and you want to put up a bunch of 5-minute little vignettes of answers. And then when somebody says, "Hey, I've got a question about your company," and you're just like, "Well, hey, I'm a little busy right now, but here's my card. Go to the website, and we've got a whole bunch of stuff up there, and they can see, oh, I have a question about this, and there's a little 2-minute podcast about it, or there's a 5-minute podcast about it." Podcast doesn't have to be an interview, and it doesn't have to be a talk show. It can just be, welcome to XYZ company website. Here's what we do. This episode is about this, and here's what you're going to learn. For more information, go to our website at blah, 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 blah. Okay? It can be just that simple. All right, so analytics. Once you're into distribution and you're doing all this, you're going to be wondering about your numbers. And by analytics, I mean how many downloads you're getting, how long are people listening to your episode, what's going on with your episodes and what's working, what's not working, all those sorts of things. First off, I will say, if you're not selling advertising on your podcast, then don't obsess. Okay, there's a lot of people who they just want to put out a podcast and they don't care who listens. They don't care if anybody listens, and they don't ever look at the numbers. They don't even know there are numbers. Okay, those people are out there. I'm mostly out there. I look at the numbers every once in a while because we are selling advertising. I had to look at them just the other day because I had somebody say, "Hey, how much to put an ad on this show?" Well, it's based on, a certain number of dollar figure per 1,000 listeners that we have, and I have to look at those numbers. Basically, look at the cost benefit analysis of looking at your numbers. Some of your websites, like your Squarespace and WordPress, they're going to give you some analytics on your show, but they're probably not going to be very good. A place like Libsyn is going to tell you how long somebody listened to their show if they use the Libsyn player. They're going to tell you how many downloads you got from Nigeria, last month for this episode. They're going to give you very detailed stats. Blueberry, a bunch of other ones, they all give you very detailed stats. You're going to pay for that privilege, but you have to decide, is it worth the cost? Am I trying to make money with this? Do I really need to know where to focus my energy? Who are my listeners? Are all my listeners in the UK? So I should have more UK-based episodes or, focused episodes or topics they're interested in. Should I do that? Should I not do that? Stuff like that. But you have to decide for yourself, is that important to me? Do I actually need that? Okay. Before you get into the weeds on analytics. My advice is just start doing the podcast, and then maybe after 10 or 20 episodes, then you can start looking at your numbers. But the thing is, if you only had 100 people download your last episode, who cares? If it's up for 2 or 3 years, 10,000 people might see it in that time frame. If it's a niche topic and people aren't coming to it right away, but it's up as a resource for all time, as long as you have it keep going. So Google Analytics is another way. If you know how to set that up, it can be a little complicated, but you have to set up Google Analytics the right way to tell you what you need it to tell you. It can be a powerful tool if you know what you're doing. Might be beneficial to hire somebody to set up your analytics, and then you can just manage it from there and read the information. And then, like I said, some websites have analytics. Squarespace will give me very basic information on RSS subscribers and things like that, but that information kind of, take it with a grain of salt a little bit. All right, so actual monetization. There's different ways to do that. The most simple and obvious way is advertising. Sell advertising on your podcast. You can say, hey, I've got a segment at 3 segments, 20 minutes long. So at 20 and 40 minutes, I have 30-second ad spot available. I have 10,000 downloads. Here you go. It's going to cost $600 to advertise on my show, and just see how they go. Some people might be more savvy with that and say, hey, I want a contract, I want all these things. Decide what is worth it for you. If you're selling ads on your show and you're making $150 a month, maybe that's fine. But if it's not worth it to you, unless you're making $500 or $1,000 a month, then just wait on the ads, because otherwise the work is going to be way more involved for that little money, because you don't have the listeners yet. Once you have the listeners, then that same amount of work becomes worth a lot more money and makes worth doing the contracts and the advertising, makes it more worth it. Because advertising, you have to keep in mind, is a constant animal that needs feeding, okay? You'll sell an ad maybe for a couple shows or maybe for a 3-month run or something like that. And then when that's done, you're back to square one. You got to do it again, or you have to have somebody else lined up, or you have to make a new contract or something like that. It's a never ending journey, and you have to figure out whether or not it's worth it. Another way to make money with your podcast is sponsorship. Okay. Sponsorship is basically, the Archaeology Podcast Network is going to sponsor your show, and you maybe put a little sponsor message at the beginning and say, this episode or this show is brought to you by the Archaeology Podcast Network. You hear that at the beginning of lots of PBS shows and things like that. This show is brought to you by the blah, blah, blah foundation and all these other things. They just basically gave money. They're not advertising, but they gave money to say, we support this show and we want to see it keep going, and here's some money to help do that. So sponsorship can be not listener-based, but basically a donation, which I think is great because it's way less work for you. Okay, so if you can find people to sponsor you in your industry, then do that. Affiliates is another way to make money, and affiliates is basically, I'm selling something. I want to advertise that thing on your podcast, but I'm not going to pay you for advertising. What I'm selling is $500, and I'm going to give you $200 every time somebody uses the code from or comes to me from your website. That's affiliates, okay? That's a really great way to make money if the things are high priced, and you have to have a good relationship with your affiliate. There are some third parties you can use where so the affiliate doesn't screw you, because there's really no way for you to know, unless you use one of those third party services, how many of the things were sold by that affiliate. They could say, oh, we only sold 10, but they sold 100, and then they give you a smaller check. I'm not saying they would do that, but that's why we just take the middleman, take the ambiguity out of it, and we create a relationship with a third-party intermediary that handles that affiliate relationship. Patreon is another one. It's basically pay to play. You can go there. There's a bunch of different models people use, but you can put stuff on a free website, let's say, and then for bonus content, or maybe all your content, who knows, people go to Patreon, and then they either pay per episode or they pay per month for a certain amount of episodes, however you set that up. Another thing you can do is a member site. So the APN, we set up a member site in 2017 where we have 3 levels of membership, and we offer various things at those different levels. And that's a way for people to not only support us, but then get something back in return that's in addition to the normal podcast. None of our podcasts changed when we started the member site. For us, this is just how we did it. All of our podcasts are still free. They're still available in the same places, but there's extra content that we're creating that's available for the members. And there's, coffee mugs and t-shirts and things like that. And that stuff's available for the members at either a discount or free. Marketing referrals. That's another way to monetize your podcast. And basically what I mean by that is anytime, it's kind of like affiliate marketing, but it's basically anytime you refer somebody to another site and they say, oh, how did you hear about us? Well, I heard about you on the Archaeology Podcast Network. Bam, you just made $25 or whatever that referral is worth for you. Again, it's kind of sketchy if you don't have third party going in between there. And you have to really trust the marketing relationship that you have. So those are a bunch of ways that you can try to start making money off of your podcast. Okay, so those are basically the basics behind getting started in podcasting. Hopefully now you know a little bit about what's involved. Hopefully I didn't scare you too much. This picture that's in the background is actually our mic and studio setup. We've actually added some things since then. It's relatively basic. I mean, for no more than about $300, you can set that up. It might sound like a lot of money, but there are studios out there that cost thousands of dollars. We happen to be residing in a world-class recording studio. This building used to be that. Now it's a co-working space. And so we actually are in a studio. Actually, behind me is the baffling I'm in the control room, what used to be the control room for this music studio. And it's actually a really good place to record. I love it. It's awesome, but you're probably not going to get that at home. If you're setting things up at home, try doing it in a walk-in closet with lots of clothes, because that cuts down on the echo, the room echo. Try putting a blanket or something over your head and microphone, but make sure you're not touching the microphone for that scratchy sound, because that also cuts down an echo and makes your podcast sound better without you really doing any extra work. So Again, thank you for taking this. If you're interested in actually starting, I have another course that's being built. As you're listening to this, it's being built right now. And check back to archpodnet.com/training to see when that's going to be available. But it's basically a workshop. I'm doing the workshop live here in Reno, but it's also going to be available online. And the workshop is called From Idea to MP3, and you'll learn the basics. We'll do probably 20 minutes on the whole thing I just talked about just then. You'll actually design your show in the workshop. You'll talk about formatting. We'll talk about logo design, music, topics, and all sorts of other things. But the idea is to take you from, there'll be some prerequisites. You'll have to have your computer or tablet or whatever you're going to do. You'll have to have something to record on. If you're going to have a microphone, you'll have to have that already. And you'll have to have recording software. Because what we're going to do, if you're in the in-person workshop, you'll actually interview somebody in the workshop, and then you'll edit that, and you'll do all those things to your show that need to be done by putting it together, mixing it, doing all those things. And then you'll export it by the end of the show. But you'll leave the workshop, whether you're in person or you're doing it on your own. At the end of that workshop, you'll have your 10 episodes planned out. You'll have your logo. You'll have your music. You'll have your first episode, okay? It might be an episode you throw away. It might not be something that you actually upload, but it might be your practice episode or something like that. Especially if you're in the in-person workshop, you're probably not going to put that out as your first episode. But it gets you over that hump, gets you over that nervousness of actually recording, shows you how easy it can be, and gets you into a little bit of the editing and cutting together and stuff like that. So everybody, whether you're in the private, the webinar that you take on your own or the in-person workshop, you'll have access to a private Slack team. That'll be really important for the webinar people because you'll be able to upload and collaborate with the group, the people that are already in Slack. You'll be able to collaborate with them on, hey, here's my first 10 episode ideas. What do you think about this idea? What do you think about that? Here's my logo design. What do you think about that? A bunch of different things, and access the background group information and kind of crowdsource getting your podcast done. So that's all I've got. Thanks a lot. Check out archpodnet.com/training. Some of the things I talked about in here are at archpodnet.com/introduction. I think including this presentation and another handout that shows you different microphones and stuff like that. So check all that out. Thanks for taking this first free introductory course, and check out the other things. And if you're really interested in archaeology, or even if you're not, check out the Archaeology Podcast Network at archpodnet.com and check out /shop, and you can pick up a handy coffee mug, which are just these fantastic coffee mugs, t-shirts or stickers or anything like that. So this is Chris Webster with Getting Started in Podcasting. Thanks.
You are listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.